Yeah, Rabbi Schechter is manning.
People are still joining, so we'll just give a few minutes. We'll begin in a minute. Good evening and a Shavua Tov to all of you. On behalf of the Chevre Kedisha, of Congregation Beth Shalom, Congregation Knesset Israel, Young Israel Lawrence Cedarhurst, and the Young Israel of Widmer, I want to welcome you to a different type of Zayin Adar commemoration. All of us and many of you, for many, many years, have participated in a Chevre Kedisha dinner, Su'uda, a Malava Malka, some type of setting where everyone came together from the particular shuls in some type of eating Malava Malka situation to be followed by a program. Unfortunately, given the constraints of the situation that we find ourselves in, the members of the Chevra Kadisha for the 4 respective shuls felt that nonetheless, even though they could not have those individual gatherings, we would come together as a community to pay tribute to 5 great rabbinic figures who unfortunately passed away this year. And we will hear presentations from 5 rabbis in our community and from the overall community. It will be a night of tribute to the lives that these great personalities had lived. Before we do so, I just think it's important to mention some thanks. First, to thank Rabbi Elchanan Zon of the Vad of Queens Chevra Kadisha. His Chevra Kadisha, which has always been tremendous in its help and assistance to the respective Chevra Kadisha of the shuls, specifically this year in the pandemic, stepped forward to perform many of the taharas, where the individual shul chevras stepped back because of the delicate nature of the tahara situation given the COVID crisis. His chevra stepped forward and performed that vital act of chesed on behalf of our community. And we have a tremendous sense of hakaras hatov for those efforts. As part of this difficult year, we also want to thank Michael and his staff from Boulevard Chapels, who worked dedicatedly towards the efforts on behalf of our community, and we thank them for that. And to thank all the volunteers who make up the respective Chevra Kadisha. It is through their dedication in a year that saw many families have Shiva homes on a level that we have not seen before. They all stepped up to see to it that the chairs were there, that the arrangements were made, all helping families at a very difficult moment, and we thank them for that as well. I want to introduce our first speaker, Rabbi Herschel Schachter, who doesn't need much introduction by virtue of the fact his 50 years as a Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva University of Rietz, his being a Rosh Kollel of the Marcos Katz Kollel at YU, as well as being involved in so many different areas of Jewish communal life. But specifically this year, I want to express hakaras hatov for this past year, where Herschel Schachter was a guiding light, specifically on inyanim that touch upon the work of the Chevra Kadisha. His guidance with regards to end-of-life issues, kfura issues. Rabbis, myself, and many of the Rabbanim all turned to the psak of Rav Herschel Schachter with regards to assisting us in this pandemic year. And it is a tremendous kavod for us that Rav Schachter is participating in the Zayin Adar commemoration. So we will now turn it to Rav Herschel Schachter, who will be giving words of tribute to the Novominsker Rebbe.
Good evening, everybody. Shalom Aleichem. After I got married, I moved to Washington Heights. When I was single, I didn't even realize that there was a Yekishe community here. But after I got married, we moved here, and we live here since then. When I moved into the neighborhood, the Rosh Yeshiva in Broyers was Rabbi Naftali Friedler, and we became friendly with him. We used to visit him a lot because the first few years it took us a while till we had children. So we used to visit him, talk and learning. And then they invited him to become the Rosh Yeshiva in the head of the Kollel and the gates at Kollel. And so he left Washington Heights and he moved to England. At that time, Broyer's community invited Rabbi Perlow, who had originally taught, I think, in high school years before. And after a while, he went to Skokie to teach in the yeshiva there. So they invited him to come back to be the Rosh Yeshiva, to take over the position that Rabbi Naftali Friedler had. So when Rabbi Perlow came back to Washington Heights, he took over all the shurim of Rabbi Friedler. So one of the shurim was that in addition to the regular shurim that Rabbi Friedler gave to the Talmidim in the yeshiva, he used to give a shiur on Shabbos afternoon for the fathers of the students in the yeshiva, so they'll be able to learn along with their children. So whatever perek, whatever Masechta the yeshiva was learning, the Rabbeim were giving a shiur on. So Rabbi Friedler would give a shiur to the fathers. They should be able to learn along with their children. So Rabbi Perlo took over that shiur as well. So after being here just briefly, a couple of weeks, I think, Rabbi Perlo at that time was training his voice. He apparently he wasn't speaking properly, and he was speaking too loud, in order that his voice should project. And the doctors told him he's going to lose his vocal cords. He's going to ruin his vocal cords. He's not allowed to talk for a long, long time. So the daily shiur, he used to write on the blackboard, and he used to distribute sheets to the students. He wasn't able to talk in person. And the Shabbos afternoon shiur, he couldn't write on the blackboard. So he asked me to substitute for him. So I was his Mamali Mokem. In fact, when Breuer's built their new base medrash on Bennett Avenue, I gave the first shiur in the base medrash on Shabbos afternoon. The big Chanukah's Habayis of the base medrash was on Sunday, the next day. And then Rabbi Perlo spoke, and then his father spoke, then Rabbi Minsky Rebbe, Rabbi Perlo's father spoke, and many other rabbanim spoke. But I gave the first shiur in the new Breuer's base medrash on Shabbos afternoon. So that shiur, and then Rabbi Perlo would always remind me, don't forget, I'm only the substitute. It's basically his shiur. And when his voice gets better, he's going to take back the shiur. So I said, understood. I'm busy with my shiur in the yeshiva. I have enough work on my own. The Breuer's base medrash was never, all the years, I gave a shiur maybe 10 years, maybe a long, long time, every Shabbos afternoon. They were never learning the same thing that I was learning in my yeshiva. So I always had to prepare something else. So once the first year or two, Rabbi Perlo took back the shiur before Yontif, maybe before Pesach, before Shavuos, before Rosh Hashanah, maybe. But after the first 2 years, he never took back the shiur. So I was always saying the shiur. Then after many years, it turned out that none of the participants in the Shabbos afternoon shiur had children or grandchildren in Breuer's base medrash. So it wasn't at all for the purpose of preparing the fathers or the grandfathers to learn with their children. It was a separate shiur. So then that year they decided that they're not going to learn the same as the base medrash. They're going to learn Maseches Nida. So I gave chaburas to them on Gemara Nida. We started from the end of Nida, Haroya Kes, until the end. Then we learned the sections that were relevant to Halacha L'Maaseh. I remember there was one of the participants in this year was married for quite a while, and he had no children. In fact, years later, he passed away, and his wife, his almana, needed chalitza because he never had any children. So in the middle of this summer, when the Rabbanim, when Rabbi Schwab would go on vacation, originally I gave the shiur when Rabbi Borer was still alive. So when Rabbi Schwab would go on vacation, so they would put up a sign that all the shaylos should be asked to whoever, to Rabbi Posen. And when Rabbi Posen went on vacation, they would put up the sign. Neither Rabbi Schwab nor Rabbi Posen would be there, so they would put up a sign that they should ask whoever has shaylos should ask the shaylos to Rabbi Perlo. So I remember this fellow comes and he tells me he's married for many years and he has no children. And based on what we were learning, Halacha L'Maaseh in the Chabura on Shabbos afternoon, that was one of the later years when none of the participants in the shiur had children or grandchildren in Breuer's yeshiva. So we learned Gemara Nida. So based on what I said in the shiur, he has a shaila. That the same shaila comes up every couple of months by him. And when he asks Rabbi Posen, it's always l'chumrah. When he asks Rabbi Schwab, it's always l'chumrah. Now in the summertime, they're not here. So he asked Rabbi Perlo. So Rabbi Perlo said l'kula. And based on what I said in the shiur, it came out it should also be l'kula. So he says, what do I think? So I told him, I think you should always ask Rabbi Perlo. You shouldn't ask Rabbi Schwab. You shouldn't ask Rabbi Posen. Ask Rabbi Perlo. Anyway, but he passed away a couple of years later. He never had any children. And as I say, his wife needed chalitza. So that was the first time I met Rabbi Perlo, when he came back to Breuer's, when he was in Skokie for a while. And then he came back to Breuer's and he became the Rosh Yeshiva there. There is an Aguda minyan, that's what it was called. I don't think the minyan has too much to do with the Agudas Yisrael, but maybe the Aguda used to meet there. So there was Aguda Minyan in Washington Heights. So for a few years, I would daven in the Aguda because there was politics in the yeshiva. So I didn't want to get involved in the politics. So rather than daven in the yeshiva, I would daven in the Aguda Minyan for quite a few years. So there I had shaykhus with Rabbi Perlo. I remember on one occasion, this was very interesting. It was Shabbos Parshas Ha'azinu, and they were laning the Sedra, and then they found a mistake in the Sefer Torah. An ayin instead of an aleph, a misspelling, nothing that there's room to be makel about. So they had to put away the Sefer Torah and take out a different Sefer Torah. So the Mishnah Brura says, Mishnah Brura quotes Achronim, there is a machlokes, you have to start laning all over again from the beginning because you're not Yotze Kriyas HaTorah with the Apostle of Sefer Torah. The Rambam in the Mishnah Torah says that you can't be Yotze the mitzvah of Kriyas HaTorah unless the Sefer Torah is kosher. But the Rambam in the Tshuva, which was written earlier, writes not so, that you don't need a kosher Sefer Torah for Kriyas HaTorah. So the Psak HaMekubal, the accepted Psak and Shulchan Aruch is from the Rebbe of the Beis Yosef, Mari Beirav, that b'di'evid, if you already read half the Sedra, so b'di'evid we rely on the Tshuvas HaRambam, you don't have to lane over. So the Mishnah Brura has a psak from later Achronim that they recommend, if it's possible, to squeeze in 7 aliyahs from that when you take out the new kosher Sefer Torah. So you don't lane over what you laned before. Let's say you laned already 3 or 4 Sedras, but you yotze that. But if you can squeeze in 7 aliyahs from here to the end, you do that. So Rabbi Perlo, on the spur of the moment, so he said, oh, the Mishnah Brura has this recommendation, and they squeezed in 7 aliyahs. No one would have realized that that psak only applies the other parshios of the year, with the one exception of Ha'azinu. So in Shabbos afternoon, there was always an early minyan for mincha at the Aguda, always 1:45. I think maybe at that time it was 1:30, then they changed it to 1:45. So that summer and winter, they can always have an early minyan for mincha, and you can have shalosh shudas after. So when we came back to daven mincha in the shul, so Rabbi Perlo made an announcement before they said Ashrei. He said, I made a mistake this morning. The psak that the Mishnah Brura writes that you should try to squeeze in 7 aliyahs, make sofas, that applies only to every other sedra aside from Ha'azinu. Because the Gemara Maseches Rosh Hashanah has a din that when you lay in Ha'azinu, you have to stop at Ha'azinu is a poem. And if you stop in the wrong place, so you kill the whole meaning of the poem. So the Gemara says you're not allowed to make sofas in the middle of Ha'azinu, you have to lay in Ha'zivloch. So he said he told the people he made a mistake. That's called intellectual honesty. In the Gemara, you have Rava has that every so often. He would make an announcement. He would give a psak in public, and then later he would realize that it was not correct. So he would tell the public, that that's not correct. I don't think anybody in the basement, and no one in the minyan would have realized that it was incorrect. But he felt obligated to correct it the same day, right before Mincha. He told everybody that it wasn't correct. I remember it's almost Purim now. I remember when Rabbi Perlo's father passed away. I don't remember what season of the year it was, but it must have been, it was on Purim, he was in Avelus. And nonetheless, the Aguda Minyan had a Mesiba on Purim. I don't remember whether in the daytime or the nighttime, I don't remember. So I went to the Mesiba. So Rabbi Perlo was in Avelus, but he felt Meshubah to the Kehillah. That is not right because he's in Avelus. So he doesn't participate. So he came and he was singing and praving regular Purim, like a regular Purim, because he felt Meshubah to the Kehillah. Yeah. And I remember at that time I didn't have a beard at all. So he had a big shtreimel, spodik, whatever it was, I forgot already. So he took the shtreimel, he took my hat, he put on my hat, and he put the big shtreimel, I was sitting next to him. He put the big shtreimel on top of my head. And then he says, my cheeks are crying. There's no hair over here. All the hair is on top because he put this big shtreimel on top of my head. So he said, the cheeks are crying. They don't have any hair. I should grow a beard. Quite a few years later, I did grow a beard. He was a very big Talmid Chacham. He said the few shiurim that I heard from him before he lost his voice, and then later the shiurim that I heard were very pleasant shiurim, and we used to visit by him and talk and learning a lot. And I think it was a big loss. He was a very reasonable person when people had issues in hashkafa, or issues in klal things. He wasn't extreme. He always had a reasonable position on things, and he wasn't a political person. He would give an eitzah that he felt was best for this situation. We will certainly be missing him and his cool, calm eitzes that he always gave. He zichra baruch.
Sure, I'm speaking on behalf of everybody here. We can have many nights talking about the Schoshev Gedolim, the Schoshev Rabbonim, and certainly we can hear of Hershel Shechter Shlita all night. What a tremendous, tremendous achos. Good tavach, gesund tavach, shavua tov. I want to just preface by thanking Rabbi Axelrod and Rabbi Shai Shechter, really putting this together. Tremendous, tremendous achos. Harabim, tremendous riboy, quote Shemayim, Tiska Lemitzvus, with a call to Sela and a special Akarsa Tov, as Rabbi Axelrod mentioned to Rabbi Chanan Zon, and ask all the fantastic work Befrat and the current pandemic. What they have done is truly extraordinary. So I'd like to thank them, and of course the White Shul Chevre Kadisha, chaired by Fred Shulman, Gitti Neufeld, and all the Chevre Kadisha that are joining here this evening, and the Avodas HaKodesh, the time, the effort, the leiv and nefesh that they have put in and continue to put in on a regular, ongoing basis, truly remarkable. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu should have mavarach them as well, and Baruch Niyas V'Gashmiyas and in all in Yanim. Continuing this evening, we have a very special treat as well. We have had in the White Shul the schus of having Rabbi Chanan Adar Shlita be a scholar in residence, and Baruch Hashem, people are still talking about it today. Rabbi Chanan Adar has served as a Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshiva University's REITs. Rabbeinu Yitzchak Chanan sang shir since 1998, over 2 decades of being a renowned Maggid Shir, also a prolific author. He has penned numerous fantastic svarim. I do have a couple of them. I'm waiting to get the rest, but the ones that I've seen, incredibly, immensely enjoyable. And he is not just a great writer, he's a fantastic Maggid Shir, a great scholar in residence. So I'd like to strongly recommend that all the other shuls have the opportunity as well. And we, of course, have the schus of hearing him tonight. He has a great resume, having learned in renowned yeshivas. He learned in Beis Yosef Nevardik. Rabbi Chanan Adar learned in the Mir Yeshiva. And pertinent to tonight's discussion, he learned in MTJ, Mesivta Tefres Yushalayim, where he received smicha from Reb David Feinstein, Zechat Tzadik Levracha, of whom he was zocha not only himself, but his entire family. And the Adar family had a very close filial bond, a relationship with Reb David Zatzal for close to 50 years, having grown up on the Lower East Side, maintaining that close connection up until Reb David Zatzal's Patira. And it's a special schos that we have tonight to hear from Rabbi Adar Shlita share with us some words of tribute and memory of Rav David Feinstein, Zechat Tzadik Levracha.
Rabbi Adler, you're muted.
I apologize. Okay, we'll try again. Okay. Okay. Birshus Rabbanim Chashuvim. Birshus Kvod Rav Shechter Shlita, but Berosham Birshus Chevra Kadisha. The Chesed Shalemis that you do is really amazing, and it's the impetus for tonight's program. Morev Rabosai, to portray the uniqueness of any individual within 10 or 15 minutes of a time frame is virtually impossible, let alone a Gadol Torah of Rav David's stature, someone who Rav Shmuel Kamenetsky said about him, he's a Yachid B'mino, one of a kind. Posek of American Jewry, Rosh Yeshiva, Mesivta Tveres Yerushalayim, where his illustrious father of Moshe Zatzal served before him, father figure and Rebbe to the Lower East Side, and ever accessible to Amcha. However, I will do my best to share a few impressions and hopefully some inspiration. I grew up on the Lower East Side, and I feel blessed to have had a lifelong connection with Rav David Zatzal. Our families go back to before I was born, and my father, Zayin Gesund, was a Talmud of Rav Moshe and knew Rav David from his youth. Rav David was a source of quiet encouragement in my formative years and beyond. I can still hear him saying to me as a teenager, "Chanan Asher, go daven for the Yamud." I was a bashful teenager then, and it did a lot of good for me in terms of my confidence, and you can't really say no to Rav David. He was a part of many milestones in my life, signing my smicha unpretentiously in the corridor outside his office, when I brought my wife, when I became a chassan, getting a bracha with my kala. He attended a Sheva brachas that we had in MTJ in the dining room, and then my daughter's chasana 23 years later, extending many brachas over the years, and always conveying a sense that he took pride in my every accomplishment. But it wasn't just me. Everyone on the Lower East Side felt a personal connection with Rav David. He was very much a part of the community, and his very presence was a comforting and positive force. Like the Rashi says in Vayetze, Bizman she'at tzadik ba'ir, hu hoda, hu ziva, hu hadara. We all felt very lucky and privileged because his light wasn't just coming from a lighthouse in an ivory tower that was shining upon us. His light was literally among us. He carried himself unpretentiously. He shopped in the local grocery stores, frequented the local pizza shop, replenished the soda machine in MTJ, and he wore a trademark smile that put everybody at ease. But Rav David's down-to-earth simplicity and common touch belied a greatness in Torah that was in a category all of its own. And his influence extended far beyond the local community, impacting on all of Klal Yisrael. Like his father, Rav Moshe Zatzal, Rav David's psak and eitzah was sought out by people of all stripes across the spectrum of the Orthodox world. The most complicated and intricate shilas found their way to Rav David, and he was blessed with an ability and a siyata d'shmaya to respond with laser precision and in accordance with the individual circumstances. He didn't give a cookie cutter answer, but he took in the nuances and the context of each situation. Rav David's mastery of Torah was legendary. His chavrusa for the past 26 years, Rabbi Baruch Moskowitz, a Talmud Chacham in his own right, who authored 2 thick volumes summarizing halachic discussions that he had with Rav David over the many years, told me the following. He would prepare for months, literally months, a sugya before he felt comfortable enough discussing it with Rav David. And Rav David himself didn't appear to need any preparation. He was always holding in whatever sugya they would bring up. There were a few occasions, Rabbi Moskowitz told me, that Rav David realized that he, Rabbi Moskowitz, wasn't fully prepared. And so Rav David asked him to go back and review the sugya some more before they could resume learning together. As a Rosh Yeshiva, Rav David gave 2 daily Gemara shiurim in the yeshiva. He gave also public shiurim. He gave a weekly Chumash shir on Friday, a weekly Mishnah Berurah shir on Sunday, and each year, big highlight before Purim, this time of year, Megillas Esther shir, and before Pesach, a Haggadah Shel Pesach shir. The last 6 or 7 years, I took many of my Talmidim to MTJ for that Haggadah Shel Pesach shir. You couldn't get a seat. Literally, people were standing in the aisles. Every morning after Shachris, Rav David would learn several Mishnayos with the Pirush of the Bartanura in the back of the Beis Medrash. Rav David's style was always very down to earth, and he had a very popular appeal. It was striking to see the eclectic mix of people who attended the shiurim, people of diverse ages and backgrounds, retirees, Koil Yungelite, Yeshiva Bacharim, Bali Tshuva, Rebbeim at the yeshiva, and also college professors. One professor in particular of anthropology, his name is Jonathan Boyarin, He even authored a book about his experiences a whole year learning in Rav David's shir entitled Yeshiva Days, Learning on the Lower East Side. The Beis Medrash of MTJ also housed a kollel, halacha kollel, known as Beis Medrash L'Torah V'Horah, which was established by Rav Moshe Zatzal. Rav David personally oversaw every aspect of the kollel, from the actual learning to the financial details. Beyond MTJ, Rav David's impact on Klal Yisrael was felt through his involvement with many communal organizations. These included, of course, Agudas Yisrael. He was on the Moetzes, Art Scroll, where he was probably the greatest single rabbinic influence, being a close confidant of Rav Meir Zlotowitz, and also Chinuch Atzmai, a network of Torah schools in Eretz Yisrael. I remember many times being at Mincha at MTJ at 1:30 Mincha, there was always someone making the rounds with outstretched hands, chanting Chinuch Atzmai, Chinuch Atzmai, and after Mincha, they would faithfully bring the few dollars to Rav David afterwards. I remember doing it myself on a number of occasions. In recent years, at a very advanced age, Rav David traveled on behalf of Jewish children from France. Beyond the formal tzedakahs, Rav David used to personally raise lots of money for individuals who were in need. As I mentioned in the beginning, Rav David's greatness in Torah went side by side with a natural anova and tznius. He carried no ears, no sense of his own self, of his importance. He was gentle and very relatable. He didn't have a formal gabbai. There were a few people who tried to be something of a gabbai, but no formalities. He told those around him not to be protective of his phone number and to prevent anyone from speaking to him. There are many anecdotes that I could share if time allowed it, but I think it might even be appropriate that I not elaborate too much, because brevity was part of what typified Rav David. His style was not flowery or verbose. He was sparing with words, and he rarely delivered public drushes. His responses to shilas were known for being succinct and to the point. And this quality was affectionately noted by his father, Rav Moshe, who said at the occasion of Rav David's 25th anniversary in 1977, and it's quoted in the Sefer Kol Ram in Parshas Vayakhel, everyone knows his greatness in Torah and his conduct. His shita is to limit his speech. But on the other hand, what he has to say, what he needs to say, he says with clarity. Rav David's self-restraint in speech enabled him to embody a midah that Chazal referred to as hanalavim be'enam ovin, shomen cherpasam be'enam meshivin, people who, even when insulted, would have the discipline not to respond in kind. Rabbi Moskowitz, who I mentioned earlier, describes the time that he was standing in the back of Rav David's office, looking up something in the Sefer. He happened to be behind a divider, so his presence was not apparent. At some point, somebody entered the front area of the office where Rav David was sitting. Suddenly, Rabbi Baruch Moskowitz was startled to hear all kinds of insults being hurled at Rav David. Rabbi Moskowitz was literally cringing in the back area, completely frozen and at a loss as to what to say or do. Rav David remained completely silent throughout without saying a word. Finally, the man left, and when Rabbi Moskowitz came out from the back of the office, he was astounded that Rav David simply engaged him in normal conversation as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened, not emoting, not processing, not speaking badly of the person or speaking about the incident at all. A similar story, a number of years ago at the Aguda convention, I heard this from Rabbi Zlibel, so I imagine it's quite reliable. Rav David gave a shir on healing and halacha, and he touched on a very sensitive end-of-life issue. and that very delicate issue. At some point in the shir, after the shir, a woman who was present, who was representative of Bikur Cholim, got up in front of everyone and began to complain about this psak, arguing, we don't do things that way. You can imagine how everyone must have been feeling at this moment. Rav David let her go on and on without interrupting her, without trying to defend his kavod or his position. When she finished, he simply said to the audience succinctly and graciously, okay, so now you have another opinion. And that was that. I want to conclude with a medrash in Megillas Esther that also highlights the importance of exercising discretion and self-discipline with our speech. On the pasuk, Ein Esther Magedes Moladata Ve'es Ama, the Medrash highlights the quality that Esther had of shtika and associates it with a line of descendants of Rachel Imenu, who also embodied the trait. Ein Esther Magedes Moladata Melamid Shetafsa Shtika Ba'atzma, Kirachel's Kenasa Shetafsa Pelach Shtika, just as Rachel was silent when Leah became Yaakov's wife. And it goes on and talks about Binyamin, Tafas Bishtika. Binyamin knew that Yosef was sold. He didn't reveal to Yaakov. That's why his stone was called Yashpe, Yeshpo. He had a mouth, but he didn't speak. Also, Shaul HaMelech, descendant of Rachel, did not reveal that Shmuel had made him king. So too, says the Medrash, Ein Esther Magedes Moladata Ve'es Ama. Rav David's Gaonus was larger than life. His godless Torah would be very hard for any one of us to aspire to, maybe Rav Shechter, but anyone else here, I don't think would put ourselves in that kind of league. But it would be fitting for us to think about how we can eternalize some of Rav David's remarkable midas tovos. And I believe that the koach hashtika is something that the world is sorely in need of. How much lashon hara, mal b'pnei chaver b'rabim, and family conflict is caused by loose lips. How much degradation of Talmidei Chachamim, of Torah, how much chil Hashem comes from the wrong words said at the wrong time. How much good would come from more shtika, from being conscious of what comes out of our mouths, restraining ourselves from impulsive outbursts, even when under verbal attack, and instead using our words to bring shalom, a value that was so close to Rav David's heart. He so scrupulously avoided anything that smacked of machlokes. And maybe this is an appropriate midah to work on in Adar, in the spirit of Ein Esther Magedes Moladata Ve'es Ama. May our efforts, however modest, to emulate Rav David be a schus for his neshama. May he be a meritz yosher for us and all Klal Yisrael. Yehi zechro baruch.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Adler. We're now going to move along with the next wonderful part of our program. We really would like to thank Rabbi Jacob J. Schachter for taking time to join us this evening and to give us an appreciation for the relationship that he had and the lessons that he learned from the legendary Rabbi Yehuda Kellemer. For all of us who live out here on the island, we are well aware of what a larger-than-life personality Rabbi Kellemer was and how special he was to not just the members of our community, but certainly to the Rabbanim who felt very close with him as well. And it's in that spirit that we felt it was so appropriate to honor his memory tonight with a few words from a very dear Talmud Chaver of his. So without further ado, Rabbi Schachter.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Schachter, for the introduction. And thank you, all of you who are responsible for tonight's program, for putting it together. And thank you for including Rabbi Yehuda Kellemer in the list of luminaries whose memory we focus on this very special time. Normally, Zayin Adar is a time to be able to get together, as Rabbi Axelrod mentioned, but now we're not able to do so. And so to have a chance to hear about and to learn about the great Jews who passed away within the last couple of months is certainly appropriate. And to try to determine what we can do to continue appropriate behavior in their memory. I am still, as are so many, deeply, deeply saddened by the patira of Rabbi Yehuda Kellemer. And I still find it very hard to believe that this exceptional Adam Gadol is no longer with us. I would say that Rabbi Kellemer was one of the most remarkable Jews and human beings that I ever met. We've been sharing, Rav Schechter and Rabbi Adler shared a little bit about their own connections with the person about whom they're speaking. So I'll share a little bit about mine as well. We met over 50 years ago in the late 60s in the Beis Medrash of the Miri Yeshiva in Yerushalayim. Rabbi Kellemer was a Telzer, learned for a number of years in Telz. And in 1966, he came with his wife to learn in the Mir. I came in 1967, and that was the first encounter I had with him. My memory of him is walking into the Beis Medrash very quickly. I have this image of him walking, but walking with deliberate speed to be able to get to his makom in the Beis Medrash. We met again when I moved to Boston in 1973, shortly after he became the rabbi of the Young Israel of Brookline. I lived far away. I davened in the Beis Medrash of the Bostoner Rebbe, but for Shabbos HaGadol and Shabbos Shuvah, I would make the trek to the Young Israel of Brookline to listen to Rabbi Kellemer. Our relationship became much more intense after both of us moved to New York. He moved to West Hempstead. I became the rabbi of the Jewish Center on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And it was a big honor for me when he invited me to address the audience at his installation at the Young Israel of West Hempstead. In a sense, I feel that it's bookends, that I welcomed him into the New York area, and I've already had a few occasions to speak about him after his patira. I want to focus on two aspects of Rabbi Kellemer that I myself personally experienced and that I know that many others did as well. Number one, and I don't want to overstate this, and I'm not overstating it, he helped me and he helped dozens of Rabbanim. And I got the sense from a previous comment that that was true with regard to the Rabbanim in your neighborhood as well. Answer very, very complex shilas. I don't want to overstate the fact that my experience with him was that he had mamish arba'a chelkei shulchan aruch at his fingertips. I do not know another pulpit rabbi, especially a pulpit rabbi in a modern Orthodox shul. Interestingly, Rabbi Kellemer spent his career in modern Orthodox shuls. He did not raise his children al pi shitas modern Orthodoxy, whatever that means, but he lived his professional life in the modern Orthodox community. I know no one who knew mamish arba'a chelkei shulchan aruch, and I know it because I asked him shilas that spanned the gamut of all issues, and he had the answer immediately, concisely, helpfully, and quoting the Simon and the Lusha. There were rare times when he wasn't sure. And he would say to me, he'd say, you know what? I need to make a call to my brother-in-law, Rabbi Walken in Yerushalayim. I'm going to ask him the Shaila. I'm going to ask him to go into Rabbi Yashiv and ask Rabbi Yashiv the Shaila. I'm going to get back to you in 24 hours. And it never failed that he got back to me in 24 hours. His shul exploded. He had probably altogether thousands of members of his shul, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of families, thousands of members that he cared for, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But this was on his mind, and he answered, and he didn't delay. In the early 2000s, I started a program, a Yarchei Kala program for Rabbanim all across the United States and beyond. And early on, I invited Rabbi Kellemer to come to one of our conferences. And the result was that now there were 40 additional rabbis, in addition to me, who also turned to Rabbi Kellemer and asked him their shilas. he became a paisik for tens of thousands of families, and he treated them the way he treated me, with care and with kindness. Now, you had to understand that the only way to get to Rabbi Kellemer was to call him at 1 a.m. because he was very busy. So I would tell my rabbinic colleagues, here's the deal. I'm going to give you 4 cell numbers. Start calling at 12:30. I can't tell you how many times I went to sleep and I set my alarm for 12:30 in the morning so I should be able to call him. And the first 2 cell phones were busy. It's now 1:45. He has 4 cell phones. 2 of them are busy, which means he's talking on both of them at the same time. And he had time for everybody. I didn't only send him Rabbanim, I sent him simple Vela Yidden, Pashat Balabatim, who had end-of-life issues, who had fertility issues, who had Dine Mumminus issues, and more. He treated everyone with an extraordinary derech eretz, with dignity, with menschlichkeit. Mechotev eitzecha ad sheyev meimecha. Everybody got from him respect, and you imagined that there was nothing else that was on his mind. So number one, Rabbi Kellemer is a posek. He was a rabbi of a shul. He was a pulpit rabbi of a shul. He lived in a community, and his reach extended just astronomically. I cannot tell you how many people besides me are crying because we're bereft. We're bereft. He lived in our community. He lived surrounded by balabatim like ours. He understood our community. And we asked him. I'm getting calls from people who say, what am I going to do? His impact was extraordinary. I want to conclude with very briefly one other aspect, and that is his Ben Adam Lachavero, people in his shul. And I wish I had the time. Rabbi Adler said he could talk for a long time about Reb David Zatzal. I wish I had the time to share my own stories, but I spoke at the Shloshim for Rabbi Kellemer at the Young Israel of West Hempstead, and there were way over 1,000 people on the Shloshim, and I invited each one of them to share a story, and there's no question that they all had stories in the hospital, 2 o'clock in the morning, traveling for chasanas. He didn't fly in an airplane. He took trains. He had people drive him. It was unbelievable. His Rebbitzin, a tzaddikus of the highest order. He devoted so much time and attention and effort and care to his members and to so many other. And he did so with radical self-effacement. Whenever I wanted to thank him, I wanted to point out to him and tell him how much I appreciated, how great he was. It was mamish mevatel ka'afra da'ara. He was totally self-effacing. He had an incredible impact. Baruch Hashem, he had a large family. His family should continue in his ways, and I know that they are. His Rebbitzin should have nechama. The family should have nechama. All of us who look to him for guidance and advice should have nechama. And I think the way to think about taking his lessons forward, Rabbi Adler, I think appropriately said, we can't be Reb David, but what are we going to learn from Reb David? What we could learn from Rabbi Kellemer is to pay chesed forward. Pay chesed forward. And that is when we have an opportunity to do a chesed. And it's not just to write out a check, but it's a chesed shebeguf. Why is the Chevra Kadisha so extraordinary? Why is it that I have such derech eretz for all of you, from all of your shuls, who are so involved in the Chevra Kadisha? Because it's not writing out a check. It's schlepping at night when it's cold, when you'd rather be home, when you have what to do, but you get a call, we need you, and you drop everything, and you're meiser nefesh mamis. It's chesed shebeguf. Chesed shebeguf is the greatest chesed. Elu devarim she'en lohem shir. Ha'peah v'habikurim v'arainu gemilos chasodim. The Pnei Moshe on the Yerushalmi says it's chesed shebeguf. It's based on a Rambam in Hilchos Avel that chesed shebeguf has no shear, but chesed shebemamon does have a shear. There's a chomesh. More than a chomesh, you're not mechuyev, but chesed shebeguf has no shear. Rabbi Kellemer represented that. All the members of the Chevra Kadisha represent that. We thank you very much on behalf of all the members of your respective communities for the work that you do. And keep in mind the tzura of an Adam Gadol like Rabbi Yehuda Kellemer, who gave his life through fully acting in accordance with Chesed Shebeguf. And we should be zoche that in his memory, we should be zoche to be able to continue to behave in those appropriate ways for ourselves, for our communities, and for our families, and for Klal Yisrael. His memory should be for a blessing.
Shalom Aleichem, everybody. Good vach. Thank you, Rav Shechter. Really, just so inspirational to be continuing to learn. We're going to move on to the next step of the program, and for this step of the program, just want to recognize and thank Rabbi Axelrod and Rabbi Shai Shechter and the incredible team to make this a communal project, and also recognize the Chevra Kadishas of all the shuls, our shul, all the people who go out without recognition, and for the Chevra Kadisha of Queens, which has really extended itself to us and availed itself through this last complicated year. This moment we're going to take to reflect on one of the Gedolim, one of the great personalities, Torah leaders of this last year, who's passed away in this last year, somebody who all of us know, whether it be through his influence, through his institutions, through his writings, through his personality, Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb, who really, I would say, we would not be where we were as a community without him. And to do that, we welcome to our community Rabbi Ari Lamb, who better than a rising star person who I'm sure, if you've not had a chance yet to read, to listen, to follow, is an incredible leader in his own right, and is no doubt bringing tremendous kavod to Rabbi Lamb himself. Rabbi Ari Lamb is the chief executive of Bnei Zayin, and founder of the Joshua Project, also being a founding editor of the Lur House. And it is our great pleasure to welcome him to our community to share and to reflect on this illustrious individual in the life of American and world Jewry.
Very kind words. Thank you very much, Rabbi Trump. It's a dear and extraordinary pleasure to be here with all of your Bershus, all of the illustrious Rabbanim, including most especially those who spoke before me, all of whom are my teachers. Since, as far as I know, you're all forcibly muted, and I am not, and as far as I know, no one can stop me. I'm going to prove the words. I'm going to take an extra 65 seconds of your time and prove the words of my dear teacher, Rabbi Shachter, by saying just two quick things about my rabbi growing up, Rabbi Kellemer, because I simply can't help myself, as Rabbi Shachter said about the Shloshim. I remember when I was a young boy learning with a Rav in the community, and we were learning a Kehilas Yaakov together about the difference between Misasek and Davar Shein Miskavin, and we couldn't make heads or tails of it. So we went to Rabbi Kellemer to ask him a question about it, and he started quoting it by heart. It was remarkable. I've never seen anything like it in my life. So much so that anyone who grew up in the Young Israel of West Hempstead, who was together with me in Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan for Smicha, we always used to joke that when we would travel to communities as children and we would encounter pulpit rabbis who didn't know all of Shas Bal Peh, we would wonder how they got their jobs. Because after all, we grew up with Rabbi Kellemer and we didn't know anything different. So we thought that was the norm. In any event, an extraordinary man. One of my greatest Zayin Adar stories, believe it or not, actually involves my grandfather, at least indirectly. I was a young man. I think it was about my first week on the job as the rabbinic intern at the Jewish Center, where my grandfather had served as the Rav for many years. And my first rabbinic task as a young, I think I was 23, as a young 23-year-old, was to speak at the Zayin Adar gathering for the Chevra Kadisha on the west side. And the man who was presiding over the ceremonies that evening was a wonderful man, a good friend, Andy Kaplan, who's been living on the Upper West Side now for 40, 50 years. And Andy Kaplan introduced me. And the way he introduced me was he said, "We're very happy to have Rabbi Lamb with us to address us this evening." And as you know, Rabbi Lamb, and now in his head, someone who had grown up in the Jewish side for 4 or 5 decades, there will only ever and always be one Rabbi Lamb. I wasn't the real Rabbi Lamb. So he said, and as you know, Rabbi Lamb, now referring, of course, to my grandfather, Rabbi Lamb is responsible for in fact, most of the Hanhagos that we have on the Chevra Kadisha here on the Upper West Side. And I could see out of the corner of my eye, there were 3 or 4 people who were new to the Chevra Kadisha who just moved to the West Side, who didn't realize that he had switched from speaking about me and started speaking about my grandfather. And they were wondering why this 23-year-old Pisher is setting the Hanhagos for the Chevra Kadisha on the West Side. In any event, for those prone to seduction by the glamour and the glittering prizes of Jewish communal service, the verse in Koheles tells us, there was no end of all the people whom the king led. The king is the subject of the pasuk in the 4th parak. Yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. And Jewish leaders in this view are always and forever doomed to ignominy, and no one will recognize their service. Now, the reality, of course, is that few, if any, are under any sort of illusion that Jewish communal life is a path to power and prestige. But to the extent that those contemplating such service do dream sometimes of grand accomplishments, those dreams are often populated by wealthy donors, inspired congregants, or perhaps brilliant students who are searching for a mentor. But the truth of the matter is that the greatest privilege afforded Jewish leaders, whether in the pulpit or elsewhere, is the opportunity to offer help to those without the political or the financial clout to demand it. And I am thus most fortunate to have grown up in the extended household of Mori Zakeni, of my incredible, beloved teacher, Rabbi Norman Lamb, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, for whom kindness without regard to station in life was mother's milk. And I'd like to share with you the story of just one such kindness. A few years ago, I had been searching through a cache of old correspondence kept by my grandfather, and which had been entrusted to my father. And I came across a letter that, as my father later explained to me, was written by my grandfather to a young girl who was then a member of his kahila at the time, the Jewish Center in Manhattan. And the young girl, Lori, was, as my father recalled, a stunningly beautiful girl who happened to be deaf. And her deafness, unfortunately, made it difficult for her to make friends. But she always seemed to thrive when she came to shul. And more than anything, she loved this sweet little pet bird who was her constant companion and whom she kept at home. And one day, she stopped showing up to shul. And my grandfather noticed. And he clocked that she wasn't there the first week. Sure enough, the second week, she wasn't there either. The third week, he could no longer discount this as a coincidence. And so he called up her parents and was told that her bird had died. And she was so distraught over the death of her beloved pet that she refused to go out of the house. And my grandfather, out of concern for Lori and in an effort to comfort her, and now bear in mind, this was a time when my grandfather was at the height of his communal powers, philosopher, theologian, public intellectual, scholar. He was on the well-known in the public eye. He sat down for hours. My father remembered him writing the letter for hours. And he hand wrote her, a personal letter consisting of a 3-page eulogy, a hesped, for her bird. And he later published it in the shul bulletin. And I'd like to just read you really quickly just a couple of words from it. He says, "This sad occasion should give you pause for thought, as it does for me while I'm writing this letter, about how very much we have to do in the time that God has allotted us. We have so much to achieve, so much love to show, so many mitzvahs to perform, so much happiness and pride to give our parents and grandparents. And when you look at it that way, you'll see that the fact that life ends is not all bad, even if it certainly isn't all good. And that's why we Jews recite a special blessing at the occasion of death or any kind of very bad news. We say, Baruch Dayan Ha'emes, blessed is the true judge. God is a judge in the sense that he sometimes pronounces a harsh verdict and sentences one of his beloved creatures to death. But he is also true. And what he does out of love and kindness as well. He knows that by taking away life, he gives us the opportunity to fill the time we do have with all the good things that make life worth living. And then he ends it this way. He says, I know, Lori, that losing the bird was a painful experience, but I hope that the explanation I gave you will help you in some way to accept the fact with less anguish. If the death of that little bird will help you achieve this kind of perspective, then that little bird will itself have made a real contribution to your life, and in that way it will live on. He wrote this to a little girl. And it's this simple, delicate, majestic pathos that defined my grandfather. He always understood better than any person that I've ever met that the bedrock upon which great Jewish leadership, any great leadership, rests is neither political stature nor analytical prowess, but rather a deep and abiding concern for the well-being and spiritual health of every single person under your care. And this is especially the case when dealing with the end of life, even if that life might have belonged to a mere pet bird, something we might otherwise consider trivial. Because my grandfather knew well, as do all of those members of the Chevra Kadisha whom we're here tonight to honor, that when a person is struggling with a loss, the most important thing is just to be there without asking questions, just be there and do the work. And when all is said and done, this is the greatest lesson my grandfather taught me, and I think taught all of us. All the books, all the svarim, all the learned essays, all the interviews, all the scholarly disquisitions were all surpassed by this lesson, and that is great Jewish achievements, whether in scholarship, in Talmud Torah, in leadership, are built not only upon intellectual achievement, upon prowess, legerdemain, but upon a deep and abiding concern for the well-being and emotional care and health of the people who rely on you. And in this case, it was a little girl who had lost her childhood companion, and she needed not a sermon, not a drasha, not a dissertation, not a Maimer Torah, but the comforting words of a teacher and a Rachman. Yehi Zichro Baruch.
We come now to the last person that we're going to be maspid tonight. The tremendous gedolim that we've lost this year are just incredibly damaging to Klal Yisrael, but we have so much to learn from the lives that they led. I had the schus of knowing Rabbi Fabian Schoenfeld for over 40 years, and we've talked about the greatness in Torah learning of many of the people that were being maspid tonight. Sometimes you don't talk about the greatness of their Torah learning, not because it's not so great, but because other aspects of their life overshadow even their greatness in Torah. Rabbi Schoenfeld was the Rebbe Muvhak of many in being a communal Rav, being the dean of the communal Rabbanim. And it's my honor and pleasure to turn over the hesped to Rabbi Louis Wienerker, who is a member of Rabbi Schoenfeld's shul from 1965, and will tell you about his relationship with Rabbi Schoenfeld and the godless of Rabbi Fabian Schoenfeld. Zecher Tzadik Livracha.
Thank you, Rabbi Glatt. I could probably get away with just saying the following, and this would tell you about Rabbi Schoenfeld and Young Israel of Kew Gardens Hills. All 5 of the tzaddikim we've mentioned and all four of the previous speakers would have been at home in the Young Israel of Kew Gardens Hills. People ask, KGH, why did it even work? A two-fare zone, a bus to the train, apartments, garden apartments, attached houses, and yet you couldn't get a house. So what's Pshat? Pshat is the rabbi. And so let's just go through memory lane. What was the membership of the shul like? Mechanchim, principals, retired rabbis, academics, white-collar workers, blue-collar workers, Amcha. What do I add to the conversation? Is that my dad, she lived to be 120, was a 3-day-a-year Jew. And my mother, Aleh Shalom, was slowly moving towards observance. So we were welcome in the shul too. Rabbi Schoenfeld would always boast how many musmachim were in the shul, always. And again, he treated them and they treated him with dignity. He would also boast that the shul had 4 fellows who served as the Rav's Masharis. David Holzer, Barry Holzer, Kenny Brander, me. Why was the rabbi so good? What made Rabbi Schoenfeld so great as a communal rabbi? I'll use a baseball reference. We speak of a 5-tool player. You can Google it later. Some Rabbanim, and I've been blessed to meet many, many, many wonderful Rabbanim who are good at things. Rabbi Schoenfeld was just good at all things a rabbi needs. He came to America with 2 children already to learn in the Rav Shir. He was holding and learning. He was holding in halacha. Something that has become popular in the last couple of years, certainly here in Woodmere. He was holding in Chasidus. Big aficionado of the Sfas Emes. His 2 sons, Harav Yoel is Rav Yoel Yitzchak Meir, and Aryeh, my contemporary, is Yehuda Aryeh. Sfas Emes Chedushi Arim. Rabbi Schoenfeld took learning seriously, did not dumb it down. Right behind me is Tami HaMinhag and Mekori Hadinim. The one sefer I received at my bar mitzvah, I received from him. But as I said, it was Torah. It wasn't watered down. When we started becoming a little more religious, I was 10, my sister was 12. So my mother called the rabbi and said, we're going to start saying Kiddush Friday night. I'm going to brag here. At 10, I was capable of reciting the Friday night Kiddush. The rabbi said, Jill will recite the Kiddush until Louis turns 13. Halacha was halacha, make no mistake about it. And this was 1969 in Kew Gardens Hills. This was pre the year in Israel, pre the generation becoming more serious about learning. I still fold my talis Motzoi Shabbos because that's what I grew up seeing the rabbi do. We'd be finishing Vihinoam, Rabbi Shov would be folding his talis. He wouldn't fold it on Shabbos. The rabbi was also a wonderful darshan. His drushos were learned, they were funny, they were passionate, they were honest. The rabbi, you couldn't hide his passion. I thought the Rav called him a fireball. Rabbi Willig said firebrand. Either way. Rabbi Schoenfeld was just passionate. And yet, and I'll comment on something Ravari said, I never ever heard someone speak bad about the rabbi, and I never heard someone speak bad about your rabbi either. So once or twice I might have walked into another shul. To me, it was strange. What do you mean talk bad about the rabbi? I never heard anyone say a disparaging word about Rabbi Schoenfeld, and yet he was out there with his opinions. He was honest. He was honest with me. I ended up, by 1978, both my mother and grandmother had died. My sister was married, and some tzaddikim in the Kew Gardens Hills, most notably the Holzers, but also the Schoenfelds and the Shapiros took me in. And I was brash, and more than once the rabbi let me know, tone it down. The rabbi wasn't shy with his opinions, he was honest. I'll never forget, Shabbos Rosh Chodesh Mincha. The chazan reaches Yalav Yavo, the rabbi stands up, turns around, repeats Shemona Esrei. 100% I would have run to the coat room and pretended I had to take care of something. The rabbi was just a cheftza of honesty. another tool in the rabbi's toolbox. He cared globally, he cared locally. He wasn't shy about saying from the pulpit, they're challenging my Zionism. He said, look how many kids I have who live in Eretz Yisrael. He spoke about politics in the 70s. I was completely clueless. What's he talking about? But it wasn't just global, it was local. I'm now going to tell a story. I hope I'm not in trouble. When I was in the 8th grade, I applied to a yeshiva high school. Why did I apply to that yeshiva high school? Because my mother said to the rabbi, where should Lewis go? And the rabbi said where he thought I should go. I applied to that high school. I did not get in. I didn't get a waitlist letter. I got a rejection letter. I seem to have made it. But anyway, a week or two later, I got an acceptance letter. I said, Mommy, what's going on here? She said, I called the rabbi. The rabbi took care of Eretz Yisrael. He took care of the RCA, and he took care of simple people living on Aguilar Avenue, helping their children get into high school. The rabbi, as all rabbis need to be, was a role model. I never saw him do anything embarrassing, never once. He was married and widowed before I was born, 4 children. And he married the only Rebbitzin I knew, Rebbitzin Ruth. She had 4 of her own. They each had a Debbie and a Joey. Big Debbie, little Debbie, Joey and Yossi, and they had twins together. That's a lot of kids. I never saw him do anything. As a parent, I should be like the rabbi was a parent. At the funeral, Rav Yoel said, when the Israeli government said, you can't all come in, he said, I never heard such a dirty word, non-biological children. If not for the fact that someone named Schoenfeld and someone named Schindelheim, you wouldn't have known. I believe that all the Schindelheims sat Shiva for the rabbi and all the Schoenfeld sat Shiva for the Rebbitzin. The rabbi's greatness, honestly, was not the learning and the drushas and the passion. It was his pastoral abilities. I was a 6th grader in Parkway Hospital with a hernia operation in 1971, and the rabbi came to visit me. I'm still astounded by this. Hundreds of families, and he made the trip to see some nudnik 6th grader with a hernia. On that awful day in January 1976, when my mother died, it was just past 9 p.m. I hear the door open. My sister and I ran to the door. It was my father, my aunt, and the rabbi. He took care of us. My father insisted when he got remarried, only the rabbi could perform the service. At my own wedding, I was blessed to have the Rav there. When I went recently to see the pictures to send them to the Schoenfelds, I realized the Rav was Masada Kedushin, but who was in the pictures holding the kos and holding the sitter and giving the ksuba to the person to read? Rabbi Schoenfeld. Because in addition to the fact that the Rav was his Rebbe, he wasn't worried about fanfare. He just did the right thing. When my son got married out of town, we made a small Sheva Brachas basically for one reason, for the rabbi and the Rebbitzin to come. They did come. I'm going to give a couple shout outs, and not to the people who set this up, but shout out to you for making this happen. And obviously to the Chevra Kadisha, Mitzvah Shem, we won't need you. But I wrote down a list quickly after Shabbos of the following names. I'm going to get in trouble if Rabbi Willig is still on this Zoom. Listen, 15 years older than I am and 15 years younger than I am, listen to the names who came out of the shul. The Willig brothers, Rav Mordechai and Rav David. The Holzer brothers, David. Now, the guys my age just get first names. David, Barry, their nephew, Eitan. The Brander brothers, Kenny, Asher, Jonathan Horowitz in Florida, Eliakim Konigsberg in Yeshiva, Danny Rapp in Yeshiva, Danny Mann, Paskin and Shilas in Eretz Yisrael, Shalom Baum and Teaneck, Mayor Hurwitz in Texas here, Jeremy Spear in Eretz Yisrael, Tzvi Herman in Eretz Yisrael. The list goes on and on. And now, 3 stories quickly. I took too much time, sorry. A boy calls me a couple of years ago to speak at YU about the Rav, I think. What's your name? Rick Schindelheim. I said, Rick, one of the reasons I am a mensch, if I am a mensch, is your grandfather. Everyone on this chat, I'm sure, realizes a year ago when COVID happened, a young fella in Passaic named Ari Schoenfeld started Night Seder America. Of course, creative, hardworking, able to give a shiur with humor, able to bring in all kinds of people. Who else but Rav Yoel's son, Ari? A couple of years ago, I was on a tour bus in Eretz Yisrael. And of course, I schmoozed with the tour guy. What's your name? Shabi Spiro. I said, do you come from Nofi alone? He said, yeah. I said, same thing. I said, if I walk on two legs like a mensch, it's because of your grandfather. The rabbi has Chassidish children, Litvish children. He has serious modern Orthodox children. He has children in religious Zionist children in Eretz Yisrael, and many, many, many more. Using some of the names I mentioned, but oh, so many more. To paraphrase Harry Potter, all of us, we're Rabbi Schoenfeld's men through and through. Good vach, Yehei Zichro Baruch, and thank you.
We're now going to make the Siyum, the Hadron, for all of the people that learned from the respective communities. Hadron Allah, Shisha, Sidre Mishnah, V'Hadra Chalon. Daitan Allah, Shisha, Sidre Mishnah, V'Daita Chalon. Lo Nistan Sheminach, Shisha, Sidre Mishnah, Lo Sistan Sheminon, Lo Ba'alma Hadain, V'Lo Ba'alma Da'aseh. Hadron Allah, Shisha, Sidre Mishnah, V'Hadra Chalon. Daitan Allah, Shisha, Sidre Mishnah, V'Daita Chalon. Lo Nistan Sheminach, Shisha, Sidre Mishnah, Lo Sistan Sheminon, Lo Ba'alma Hadain, V'Lo Ba'alma Da'aseh. Hadron Allah, Shisha, Sidre Mishnah, V'Hadra Chalon. Daitan Allah, Shisha Sidre Mishnah v'Daitan Allah. Lo Nissa Seminach Shisha Sidre Mishnah v'Sister Seminah Lo Ba'alma Hadain v'Lo Ba'alma Da'aseh v'Harev Na Adonai Eloheinu es Divrei Seiroscha Befino v'Fiyos Amcha Beis Yisrael v'Niya Kulanu Anachnu v'Tzeitzeinu v'Tzeitzei Amcha Beis Yisrael Kulanu Yodei Shemecha v'Loimdei Serasecha L'Shma Me'oivai Techakmeini Mitzvasecha Ki Le'olam Hili Bi Samim B'Chukecha L'man Lo Evosh Le'olam Lo Eshkach Pikudecha kivam chi sani baruch ato Adonai lamdeni chukecha amen 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 sela va'ed modo anachnu lach v'fanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'lohev v'seinu shesamta chalkeinu miyosvei beis hamedrash v'lo miyosvei kranos she'anu mashkim v'hem mashkim anu mashkim l'divrei Torah v'hem mashkim l'davarim b'telim anu amelim v'hem amelim anu amelim mekabel schar v'hem amelim v'enu mekabel schar anu rotzim v'hem otzim Anu rotzen l'chayil mabah v'him rotzen v'eshachas shenemar v'atol lohim saridim v'eshachas anshe domim umirma lo yechzu yemei v'ni ech tach bach yiratzon l'fenecha Adonai Eloheinu v'lohev v'seinu kashem shezatonu l'sayim shisha sidre mishnas kach tazreinu l'haschal svar macherim u'l'saymam l'moru l'lamed mitoch harchava l'ishmar v'lasu l'kaimis kol divrei samot teresecha be'ava u'zechos kol hatanoim v'samidei chacholim hanizkarim B'shisha Sidre Mishnah v'chol Sfarim Shalavanu Yamod Lanu Uzarenu Uzarenu Shalosama Shatora Hakdosh Mepinu Pizarenu Pizarenu Me'atov V'Adolam V'Ikayim Banu Mikra Shekosa V'Salecha Tancha Isach V'Shachva Tishma Elecha V'Akitzoisa Ki Hi Sisichecha Ki V'Yirbu Yemecha V'Yosifu L'Chol Shnos Chaim Orech Yamim B'Mino V'Smola Oish V'Chavod Adonai Oz L'Amo Yitain Adonai Yivarech Es Amo V'Shalom.
We'll now recite a Kel Maleh for those Niftarim and Niftaros from the respective shuls. El Maleh Rachamim Shochein V'Amiromim Hamtzei Menucha Nechona Kanfei Ashchina B'malos Kedoshim Utorim Kezohar Rakia Mazirim Es Nishmos Kol HaNiftarim VaNiftaros Mishana She'avra Mikilos Knesses Yisrael Ubeis Shalom Yisrael HaTza'ir de Lawrence Sinners Yisrael HaTza'ir de Woodmere Shalchu L'Olamam Babur Shanachnu Mispalalim Varas Karas Nishmasam Viganei Den Teimenu Chasam Lachem Balarachamim Yastireim B'Seiser Kinafav Liolamim Vitzrar mitzar chaim es nishmasam, Adonai hu nachalasam, V'yanuchu v'shalom amishkavam, V'nomar amen.
Thank all the presenters this evening for their special heartfelt words of tribute. We want to close the program by thanking the heads of the Chevre Kedisha of our respective shuls, who dedicate themselves tirelessly to our communities. Young Azov Woodmere, Michael Kringle, Knesset Israel, Fred Schulman, and Gita Neufeld, Young Azov Lawrence Cedarhurst, Zev Golumbek, Congregation Beth Shalom, Joey Honeg, and Dora Gluck. We wish you all a Shavua Tov, and as was mentioned by so many of the presenters, for all of us to hear the words of the lives of these great rabbinic figures who touched so many in their lifetime, but also their memories should assist us in touching others, as was quoted, to pay it forward, to take the lessons of their lives and to implement it into our own. And in so doing, Yaakov Avinu Lo Meis, these great rabbinic figures live on through our own actions. Wish you all a good evening. Thank you very much for participating.